The hidden rules every prison inmate must follow. The rules you never see. Prison rules are not always written down. Every correctional facility has an official rulebook, hundreds of pages outlining what inmates can wear, when they can eat, and how they are disciplined. But across the United States and other prison systems around the world, there exists another set of rules. They are not posted on the wall. They are not explained during intake. And breaking them can carry consequences far more immediate than a disciplinary report. These are the unwritten rules, systems of conduct enforced not by prison administrators, but by the inmates themselves. They shape daily survival. They determine who eats in peace, who is protected, and who becomes a target. And while these rules are widely discussed in court testimony, academic research, investigative journalism, and first-hand prison accounts, their enforcement varies dramatically by facility, security level, and population. What follows is not myth, exaggeration, or Hollywood fiction. It is a factual examination of the hidden inmate rules that exist inside many correctional institutions, rules that can mean the difference between stability and violence. Before we continue, if you value accurate, carefully researched prison documentaries, support the Inmate Diaries by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue documenting real prison systems, real policies, and the realities that are rarely explained to the public. Now, back inside. Why unwritten rules exist. To understand why unwritten inmate rules exist, you first have to understand what prison is structurally designed to do. Prisons are institutions built around control, scarcity, and hierarchy. In most facilities, privacy is minimal. Resources are limited. Personal safety is never guaranteed. Staff cannot monitor every interaction. According to multiple criminology studies, including research published in the Journal of Criminal Justice and the American Sociological Review, informal inmate codes develop as adaptive systems. They fill the gaps left by institutional control. In environments where reporting violence may result in retaliation, protective custody is limited or stigmatized. Guards rotate shifts and cannot witness everything. Inmates create their own mechanisms to regulate behavior. These informal systems are not universal, not standardized, and not officially sanctioned, but they are widely documented across federal, state, and local facilities. Rule number 1: Mind your business. One of the most consistently documented inmate rules across U.S. prisons is simple. Do not involve yourself in other inmates' affairs. This rule appears repeatedly in federal court testimony, Bureau of Justice statistics interviews, academic inmate ethnographies, watching disputes, asking questions, commenting on arguments. All of it can be interpreted as interference. In many facilities, being perceived as nosy can escalate quickly, especially in medium and maximum security units where gang structures or racial groupings exert influence. This is not a written regulation. It is a survival expectation. Criminologists note that prisons operate on informal boundaries, and violating those boundaries can be interpreted as disrespect, alliance building, or intelligence gathering. None of which are taken lightly. Rule number 2: Never snitch. Perhaps the most widely known, and most misunderstood, unwritten prison rule is this: never cooperate with authorities against another inmate. This rule is not universal in enforcement, but it is widely recognized. Snitching typically refers to reporting contraband, identifying participants in assaults, providing intelligence during investigations. The consequences of being labeled an informant are well documented in prison violence case studies, Department of Justice civil rights investigations, federal protective custody placement data. However, it is important to clarify something critical. Not all facilities enforce this rule equally. Some minimum security prisons see little inmate retaliation. Some inmates cooperate openly due to sentence reductions or safety needs. But in many high-security environments, informants are targeted for assault, extortion, or social isolation. This is not speculation. It is repeatedly documented in official investigations and lawsuits involving failure to protect claims. Rule number 3: respect personal space. Space inside prison is not just physical, it is symbolic. Cells are small. Dayrooms are crowded. Lines are long. Because of this, respecting another inmate's personal area becomes a strict informal rule. Documented triggers for conflict include sitting on another inmate's bunk, touching personal property, reaching into someone else's locker area. Criminal justice researchers describe these acts as territorial violations, often escalating into violence faster than verbal insults. In multiple correctional assault cases reviewed by state oversight boards, physical altercations began with something as minor as sitting on the wrong bed. This is not about ego. It is about control in an environment where very little is controllable. Rule number 4: pay your debts. Money inside prison does not function the way it does outside. Commissary items, ramen noodles, stamps, snacks, hygiene products, often serve as informal currency. Borrowing is common. So is debt. But failing to repay, even small amounts, can lead to serious consequences. According to prison sociology research, unpaid debts can result in threats, forced labor, physical assaults, sexual coercion in extreme cases. This rule is so well established that many correctional education programs warn new inmates explicitly. Do not borrow what you cannot repay. Some prisons have attempted to curb this through restrictions on inmate trading, but enforcement remains inconsistent. Rule number 5: choose your associations carefully. One of the most sensitive and dangerous aspects of prison life involves social alignment. In many U.S. prisons, particularly higher security facilities, racial, geographic, or gang-based groupings emerge. This phenomenon is documented by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, analyzed extensively in criminology literature, acknowledged in court rulings involving prison safety. Inmates are often pressured, sometimes immediately upon arrival, to associate with a group. Refusing to align can be interpreted as disrespect, vulnerability, suspicion. However, it is crucial to state clearly: not all prisons function this way. Many minimum security and specialized facilities operate with little to no gang enforcement. Some state systems actively dismantle group dominant structures. But where such groupings exist, violating expectations of loyalty or neutrality can result in retaliation. What happens when the rules are broken? The consequences are rarely official. When an inmate violates an unwritten rule, the consequences often never appear in official records. There is no disciplinary hearing, no formal charge, no written explanation. Instead, enforcement typically occurs through informal inmate discipline, which correctional researchers describe as one of the most difficult aspects of prison violence to document. According to Department of Justice investigations and independent prison oversight reports, many assaults categorized as sudden or unprovoked are later revealed, through interviews or lawsuits, to be responses to earlier social violations. The system operates quietly. And because inmates are often unwilling to testify, many of these incidents remain officially unexplained. Social isolation as punishment. Not every violation leads to violence. In fact, one of the most commonly used punishments inside prison populations is social isolation. This includes being excluded from group activities, being denied access to shared resources, being ignored entirely. Prison sociologists refer to this as informal exclusion, and it has been documented across multiple correctional systems. Isolation can be devastating inside an already isolating environment. Inmates who lose access to informal support networks often experience increased vulnerability to theft or assault, difficulty accessing commissary trades, mental health deterioration. This form of punishment is difficult for prison administrators to detect, because it violates no formal policy. Yet its impact is real and measurable. Violence as enforcement. When informal sanctions fail, violence becomes enforcement. According to Bureau of Justice statistics data, inmate-on-inmate violence is often retaliatory, not random. Assaults may follow. Failure to repay debts. Cooperation with authorities. Disrespect toward established inmate hierarchies. In many documented cases reviewed by state inspectors general, victims decline to identify their attackers, not out of confusion, but fear. This silence reinforces the unwritten code. Importantly, researchers emphasize that most inmates actively avoid violence. Conflict is risky. Punishment is severe. But the threat of violence remains a powerful enforcement mechanism, particularly in overcrowded or understaffed facilities. Why many inmates don't report? Why don't inmates report abuse or threats? The answer is complex, and supported by extensive documentation. Reporting can lead to retaliation, placement in protective custody, loss of housing, work assignments, or programs. Protective custody, while intended as a safety measure, often involves extended isolation, restricted movement, limited access to privileges. Multiple court filings describe inmates refusing protection because it felt like another form of punishment. As a result, many inmates choose silence as a survival strategy. Staff awareness and unofficial tolerance. Correctional officers are not unaware of inmate rules. In fact, training materials and internal reports acknowledge the existence of informal inmate governance. However, the relationship between staff and these systems is complicated. Officially, staff are required to prevent violence. Gang activity is prohibited. Inmate coercion violates policy. Unofficially, some officers recognize that informal rules can suppress chaos. Others intervene only when violence occurs. Oversight varies by facility, leadership, and staffing levels. Department of Justice pattern and practice investigations have found that failure to intervene early often allows inmate enforcement systems to strengthen over time. This does not imply endorsement, but it does demonstrate institutional limitations. Differences by security level. Unwritten rules are not uniform across all prisons. Security level matters. In general, minimum security facilities show fewer rigid inmate codes. Medium security prisons vary widely. Maximum security and supermax units exhibit the strongest informal enforcement. This variation is supported by Federal Bureau of Prisons facility assessments, academic comparisons across security levels, testimony from correctional administrators. Factors influencing rule strength include overcrowding, gang presence, staff-to-inmate ratios, length of inmate sentences. The harsher and longer the confinement, the more entrenched informal systems tend to become. New inmates and the learning curve. For new inmates, unwritten rules are rarely explained directly. Instead, they are learned through observation, warnings from other inmates, consequences. Mistakes are common. Correctional education research shows that the first weeks of incarceration are among the most dangerous. Not because new inmates are targeted randomly, but because they unintentionally violate expectations they didn't know existed. This period accounts for a disproportionate number of inmate injuries documented in intake assessments. Who the rules apply to, and who they don't. The myth of one prison code. One of the most persistent misconceptions about prison life is the idea of a single, universal inmate code. In reality, researchers and correctional officials agree on one critical point. There is no single set of unwritten rules that applies everywhere. Instead, inmate rule systems are local, context-dependent, shaped by facility culture, population, and leadership. Academic studies comparing prisons across different states consistently show that rules considered absolute in one institution may be irrelevant, or even dangerous, in another. This variability is one of the reasons prison stereotypes so often fail to reflect reality. Female prisons, a different social order. Unwritten rules exist in women's prisons, but they often take a different form. According to research published by the National Institute of Justice and multiple academic studies, female inmate social structures are typically less rigidly hierarchical, less dominated by gang enforcement, more relationship-centered. This does not mean women's prisons are non-violent. However, enforcement of informal rules more commonly involves social exclusion, relationship manipulation, emotional retaliation. Debt, respect, and privacy still matter. But the mechanisms differ. Importantly, researchers caution against overgeneralization. Some women's facilities, particularly those housing long-term or high-security populations, do develop rigid informal codes similar to men's prisons. Juvenile facilities and unwritten rules. Juvenile facilities present another distinct environment. Unwritten rules do exist, but they are often short-lived, highly volatile, influenced heavily by staff intervention. Department of Justice investigations into juvenile detention centers show that informal inmate hierarchies form quickly, but are disrupted more often due to shorter lengths of stay, mandatory programming, higher staff-to-youth ratios. However, abuse tied to informal rule enforcement has been documented, particularly in under-resourced facilities. This has led to numerous federal consent decrees and reforms aimed at reducing youth-on-youth violence. Protective custody and rule exemptions. Protective custody, often referred to as PC, creates a different reality. Inmates placed in protective custody include former law enforcement, high-profile defendants, inmates labeled as informants, vulnerable populations. Within these units, traditional inmate rule enforcement is often reduced or altered. However, PC comes with trade-offs. Multiple court filings and investigative reports describe protective custody as more isolating, more restrictive, mentally taxing. Some inmates remain in protective custody for years, not because of ongoing threats, but because re-entry into general population would be dangerous. Supermax prisons, rules without a society. In supermax prisons, traditional inmate rules lose much of their power. Facilities such as ADX-style institutions isolate inmates for 22 to 23 hours per day. Limited human contact. Highly controlled movement. In these environments, informal inmate governance largely collapses. Staff control replaces social enforcement. Psychological effects become the dominant concern. However, some research suggests that even limited contact, through shouting between cells or brief recreation encounters, can still transmit informal norms. The scope, however, is far narrower than in general population facilities. Which rules are mostly myth. Popular culture has created several prison rules that are not supported by evidence. Among the most exaggerated or inaccurate claims: that all inmates must immediately fight to establish dominance. That refusing to join a gang always results in violence. That every prison enforces racial segregation identically. While these scenarios have occurred in specific facilities, they are not universal experiences. Correctional researchers stress that portraying these myths as universal contributes to misunderstanding and can actually endanger newly incarcerated individuals who expect violence rather than caution. Why accuracy matters. Understanding unwritten prison rules is not about sensationalism. It matters because courts assess inmate safety based on known risks. Policymakers design reforms around documented behavior. Families prepare loved ones for incarceration. Misrepresenting prison life can obscure real problems and real solutions. Accuracy does not make prison safer, but it makes reform possible. The system behind the silence. Race, groups, and survival. Race and group alignment inside prison are often misunderstood. Research from the Federal Bureau of Prisons and multiple court rulings confirms that racial and gang-based separation is not mandated by prison policy, but can emerge informally in some high-security environments. These divisions are driven by safety concerns, historical gang structures, long-standing inmate power dynamics. However, many modern facilities actively intervene to prevent racial control, and the extent of these groupings varies widely by institution. There is no single rule, only localized realities. Can these unwritten rules be broken? Correctional reforms have attempted to weaken informal inmate governance through increased supervision, structured programming, intelligence-led gang management. Some reforms have reduced violence. Others have produced mixed results. What is clear from oversight investigations is this. As long as prisons rely on isolation, scarcity, and control, informal inmate rules continue to emerge. They adapt. They shift. But they do not disappear entirely. The final truth. The hidden rules of prison are not laws. They are coping mechanisms, survival strategies, and reflections of life inside institutions designed to remove autonomy. They are enforced not by policy, but by pressure. And understanding them means understanding prison itself. Prison life is shaped as much by what's unwritten as what's enforced. If you value factual, no exaggeration prison documentaries, subscribe to the Inmate Diaries. We document reality, exactly as it is. Until next time.